if you don't know whether you're talking to a doctor or talking to a bot, Alan Turing would say, it doesn't really matter.
Interesting.
People keep telling me chatbots don't really understand medicine. And I'm going, yeah, but Turing said that's a meaningless statement. If it gives at least as good answers as the doctor I'm talking to, what do I care whether it understands medicine? It's giving useful the right answer.
Hello, and welcome to Informatics in the Round, the podcast that's designed to have every kitchen table in the country talking about informatics and the way they can understand it. I'm your host, Kevin Johnson, a physician and informatics researcher at the University of Pennsylvania at KB Johnson, MD, on X. Today's episode is extra special. Normally, we would be calling in from all corners of the country, but today, as you can see if you're watching us on YouTube, you're going to see that we got to be together, in person, in a studio for this episode. Okay, well, almost everyone. As you can see, or as you will see, I wasn't able to make this episode, but I found an amazing stand-in. Additionally, I want to give a big shout out to the folks at Penn Engineering Online for graciously hosting us in their studio. It was the perfect place to enjoy, I think, is one of my favorite podcasts of the year. I know I say that all the time, but this time I really mean it. We've got an incredible lineup of guests, all from the University of Pennsylvania, ready to discuss one way that AI is impacting healthcare. First, we have Dr. Angela Bradbury, an associate professor of medicine and a medical ethicist at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also founder of the Penn Telegenetics Program, a national program using telehealth and digital tools to increase access to genetic medicine. Her research program has been developing patient-centered digital tools, including chatbots, and working with my lab to address the use of genetics in medicine and a limited genetics workforce. It's a real big problem. As a medical ethicist also, she is particularly interested in how we responsibly deploy digital tools and generative AI in medical practice to improve patient outcomes. We also are lucky to have Lyle Unger, professor of computer and information science from Penn. He researches the psychological dimension of natural language processing and artificial intelligence. His research group of psychologists and computer scientists study what language reveals about physical and mental well-being. His lab is building culturally aware chatbots for mental health support and teaching soft skills to high school students, which is really quite amazing. Finally, we invited and were able to secure time from the very busy Chris Callison-Birch, professor of computer and information science. CCB, as he is called, is the leading expert on AI and generative AI in particular, and has appeared in front of Congress, as well as on many podcasts to discuss the future of generative AI and intellectual property. By the way, he is a sought-after teacher, to say the least. His AI course at Penn has one of the highest enrollments at the university, with over 500 students. 500 students. His course has more teaching assistants than I have students enrolled in my classes. Anyway, Chris's research focuses on applications of large language models, or LLMs, to address long-standing challenges in artificial intelligence. We are so grateful to have all these experts together in one episode, and it's going to be really interesting. Oh, and I can't forget to introduce our special host for this episode, Ellie Schubert, our production assistant, who has stepped out from behind the scenes today. She recently graduated from Penn with a bachelor's degree in English and linguistics. Her curiosity about AI and natural language processing gave our guests lots to think about, and it was really fun to let her direct an episode. If you can't already sense a theme today, the episode is about chatbots in various contexts, from medicine to clinical research to psychology to education. I've been anticipating this, so without further ado, let's get into it.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Informatics in the Round, the podcast that's designed to produce stimulating conversation about informatics that even my parents and my grandparents can understand. As you can see, I'm not Dr. Johnson. My name is Ellie Short. I just graduated from the University of Pennsylvania this spring, but you might know me. I've come on here a couple times as the production assistant for Informatics in the Round. So I'm mostly behind the scenes, but it's fun to be in front of the camera today. So I have some really awesome guests that are able to contribute lots about their experience. So we'll start with Angela. Do you want to give a quick overview of who you are?
Sure. My name's Angela Bradbury, and I'm a physician scientist. And I lead a research and clinical program called the Penn Telegenetics Program. We've been using technology and digital tools for years to improve access to genetic services. And we're starting to use increasingly chatbots and thinking about how we would incorporate AI into that for medical practice.
Amazing. All right, moving down the line. Chris, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Chris Callison-Birch. I'm a professor in the Computer and Information Science Department here at the School of Engineering and Applied Science. My research is in the area of natural language processing, which is the subfield of AI that gave birth to these large language models that everyone is excited about now. On campus, I teach the artificial intelligence class, which has been growing and growing and growing. So last fall, I taught 750 students artificial intelligence. So any help in automating the workload via chatbots or otherwise would be great.
Awesome. And we were just laughing earlier that Chris came to my junior year creative writing class to talk about ChatGPT when it was first coming out. So that was really cool to have him come and be like, don't be afraid of this. So I'm sure we'll get into it more during this conversation. But yeah, it was cool to already have that point of connection. So next, Lyle.
I'm Lyle Unger, also computer science faculty at Penn. I've got a group that's half psychologists, half computer scientists, and we're building chatbots partly to teach high school students soft skills, how to have an informational interview, how to make a plan, and partly to figure out how to refer people, have them self-refer for mental health support. A lot of people are very uncomfortable talking to a person, particularly for marginalized, either we're working in India as well as the US, people in the gay community, often a little uncomfortable with mainstream people. Can we get chatbots that will help people figure out what they should or shouldn't be getting for healthcare services? So culturally aware chatbots.
Sure. Well, you all seem to have such different careers, especially you, Angela, in medicine. So, and I don't think many people understand the difference. I know I really don't, between like a vacuum on the floor, one of those like pet vacuums on the floor that's kind of going around your house cleaning up, versus like what AI actually is and what generative AI does. So could one of you help me understand that differentiation?
Sure. Yeah. So generative AI, or especially the language-oriented ones that you use when you're using ChatGPT, is a kind of language model. So that's something that in our field has been around for 20 years or more. So the basic way of thinking about how it's functioning is similar to how autocomplete works on your smartphone. So given what you've typed so far, it's trying to predict the next word. And then generative AI, like GPT, is not only predicting the next word, but adding that to the preceding context and continuing to generate. So it's able to produce a whole paragraph worth of text. And by scaling up to training on all of the data from the internet and with larger neural networks, it's able to produce very, very high quality texts. But I think one of the important things to keep in mind is underlying these models is essentially a bunch of word associations. So that gives rise to a bunch of things that make them unreliable. All of us by now have probably heard about the propensity to hallucinate, to generate with high sounding confidence facts that are just completely untrue. And so I think that element of the LLMs is something that we really need to be careful of when we apply them to clinical applications.
And it's uncanny, given they're just autocomplete, how often they're fluid and they generate not just text, but these days, as you well know, audio, voice. You can talk to them now. They generate images. They generate short videos, not long ones yet, that are very good.
Yeah, this formula of generative AI and pre-training on huge amounts of data and then generating outputs has just become this winning strategy for all sorts of modalities. And I think apropos to the chatbot conversation that we're having, the ability to generate synthetic voices is now really, really impressive. So just this past May, OpenAI released a version of ChatGPT that allows not only for you to talk to it and it performs speech recognition on what you say, but it also is able to respond in a very human-like fashion that's able to embody a lot more emotion and a lot more variation than previous voice synthesis systems have been able to.
Yeah.
And companies are using this a lot for customer service. And we should look at Angela, talk about what you're doing now and actually in the medical world, because it's, in spite of hallucinations, it's coming in rapidly, quickly.
Yeah, I think medicine's a unique place to think about applying any type of AI algorithms, generative AI. The medical setting is unique, where there are a lot of concerns about privacy. There's also concerns about liability and, who is responsible if the chat bot goes off the rails.
Well, I got to say, all the companies I talk to are concerned about the liability and concerned about the privacy. If you're selling stocks, a lot of the same issues do that. I do a lot of teaching stuff. I have lots of children. People are concerned about reliability and liability.
Yeah. I agree. We had a chat we were using recently in a research study, and the goal of the chat was to identify patients who are candidates for genetic testing. And it was only an algorithm, so we're not even talking about generative AI yet. And in clinic right now, you might have to fill out like a 15-page family history piece. And this chat, the big win for it was it took 5 to 7 minutes. Great. And it gives you an answer. You meet criteria, you don't. And it was a chat that had been developed by an outside company. We had worked with them along the way. But what was interesting when we started using it, it didn't have any type of audit mechanism. And we learned pretty quickly that it was making some errors. And we only learned that because it was in a research study where we were double checking everything and it was out there in the world. But it became a little interesting in some of the negotiations after this was discovered about, like, if you're telling a patient something that's actually not medically accurate, who's responsible for that? Mm-hmm. Is it us? Is it, a doctor is using it, but usually a doctor is using it because it's something they don't have a lot of skill in. Is it an institution? Is it the company? So it brought up some really interesting questions when we were using it kind of real life. It's in a research study, but the clinical testing that we offer in the study is like clinical care. So it can get a little interesting. And I'm glad everyone's thinking about it because it's going to be really important. The next time I do a contract for a chat with an algorithm like that, I will ask for different things in the contract that we didn't ask for the first time.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that kind of setting, like Lyle was saying, crisscross a lot of other industries as well. So clearly privacy is of the utmost concern when we think about FERPA and other federal requirements for health information.
HIPAA in this case, yeah.
HIPAA. And then
we do FERPA
in the university,
for education.
Right.
Same as HIPAA.
Yeah. And then, the liability, I think, is also really interesting and important to be aware of because but
one of the interesting pieces, I think, is people keep wanting to have these be the answer and end-to-end solution. And in fact, they're tremendously good assistants at doing first drafts of things, at helping. I think there's a lot of cases where patients want to have more information about how to do my post-operative care. And the moment they go to the web and they find is mostly correct and sometimes complete random crap. And GPT has read the entire web and is trained on mostly really good stuff and a certain amount that's a little bit of crap. And occasionally it quotes these nice things of how do you fix your pizza when it slides. Put a little bit of Elmer's glue, non-toxic glue to glue the topping of the pizza back on because it read it on the web. And we know everything on the web is true.
Everything, yes.
Everything is true. On the other hand, if you structure them the right way, it's still better on average than the web and way easier.
I agree. I mean, we think of this one as it had huge wins. And I think all it needed was, some guardrails, right? And some audits. And so if it had some auditing tool within it, I think it would still save a lot of patient time and huge human time on the medical side, which is important and reduces costs. and makes it more accessible.
Yeah, the cost reduction is funny. So a lot of it's back end invisible. Already what you see is doctor wants to get something reimbursed for her patient. The insurance company says no. She has to write a long, detailed letter explaining exactly why this procedure should be covered. GPT is great at reading, here's all the things that were approved and not approved. It gives a first draft of the letter for the doctor to send. She reads it through, double checks it, saves huge amounts of time. Then, of course, the insurance company gets it. Their AI then looks at it, sees which ones they've approved or denied, and does the exact same thing on the other side. But so all of this back office work of trying to figure out, and the insurance thing is such a, as you know, because, hey, you're tied to these things, it's such a pain. So much of this paperwork, not reliable, but saves enormous time in trying to pull together documentation, summarizing conversations.
And as you said, medical care is complicated, and patients are always looking for more information and reliable information. So that's the other place we've been using it. We have a particular use case right now for ApoE testing, which is something that needs to happen to get one of these new drugs for Alzheimer's disease. And the ApoE testing is one of multiple things you have to get done to get to these really great therapies. And so instead of like the traditional model of meeting with a counselor to talk about this, it's just being sent off, and patients are probably not learning a whole much about what that result means for them, except for what it means for getting to the drug. So we've started using chatbots in that setting clinically. And I think there's been patients are interested, they're using them, they're writing questions back. And so that type of engagement is really exciting. And it's an older population, right? Not even the younger population where you think maybe there would be even greater interest. So I do think there's lots of potential.
Yeah, I do want to actually I want to ask the question of, when people think of AI, I think of all of the books I grew up reading about how it would take over the world. And obviously you guys are more optimistic about the technology than that. But especially when you're entering into a clinical space, earning the trust of your patients is really key. So you said people, they're not necessarily opposed to knowing that there's chatbots involved in their clinical care or clinical research. So I'd love to hear you talk more about just that process of, introducing AI to your patients and what building that trust looks like in a technology that's very new and also has a lot of connotations around it.
Yeah, we've just started using them. We are doing a co-design meeting with some young individuals who've had a cancer diagnosis, and they're helping us think about how we're going to design these to use in clinic. And they have some great comments, that this is pretty normative. They use this stuff all the time with their peers, but they really do want that kind of credibility. So they want it coming with a notice that it's coming from their medical team, because that gets to that trust piece. And we're still starting to use it, even with the ApoE bot that we used. There were still, half of patients who didn't use it. And so we also wonder, are we creating any disparities, and why are some people using it and some people are not? And, is that an access issue? Like I said, are we already exacerbating disparities that already exist? How can we, use the technology to actually reduce disparities and help people have equal access to really reliable information?
Studies in general show that using these AIs help people who are less skilled more than people who are more skilled. And in fact, that people who have good access already to healthcare information are not benefiting as much as people who are more marginalized, less accessible. I worry actually that these things are trained on massive amounts of the average American, which means they do a great job of not just speaking average American English, but having the same sort of concerns. When I talk to many of my Chinese students, very different cultural background.
Yeah.
They're in the US. These are smart students at Penn. They're vastly ignorant about SSRIs and antidepressants and side effects compared to Americans. There's a vastly different situation, how comfortable they're talking to their parents compared to most of the American students. And even within America, there's huge differences. The Black students I have are almost the same as the white students, but their parents are really different in terms of, I realize, of mental health, depression, what they're expecting. So the same sort of advice that works great for one population with the same phrasing, you should, you must, you might, And the same thing, don't you want to talk to your parents about this? Well, maybe not. So I think the disparities, I'm much less worried about access, and I'm more worried that we've got things that are trained statistically to be average. They work pretty well for the average person, which is now missing an awful lot of the population.
A lot of people, yeah.
Seems like it's repeating a similar mistake as in other aspects of medicine, where if you leave Black populations out of your testing groups, or
women, or other minorities,
exactly.
right? So I think, I mean, the good news is that companies, at least that I talk to, that are doing this, are now super aware and are doing much more disparity checking.
Right. And
the bad news is that these systems are intrinsically not designed to capture the diversity that happens in the American population, let alone the world population.
Yeah. But again, being optimistic about the technology, I feel like that's a relatively easier problem to overcome. If you identify some way that you want it to be customized, it's fairly straightforward to adjust the sample interactions that a chatbot is trained on in order to get it to mimic the type of interactions you would like it to have.
Yes, so you find an error in the chatbot, you can fix it. You find an error in the doctor. Oh crap, there's a whole bunch of other ones that are taking the same error. It's hard to readjust the doctor.
I was thinking more like the error in the history of clinical trials are much harder to fix. But your point is well taken as well.
Yeah. I look at a lot of companies, and I look at, say, resume screening, and a lot of big companies built first passes that were very racially biased and gender biased in resume screening. They've largely fixed that. A lot of humans are still doing the hiring with the same sorts of biases. It's much harder to readjust them. So that, for me, sort of is a paradigm for medicine.
Yeah, that's so interesting, right? Because you can adjust them, but it's hard to change human behavior.
Yeah, one by one for the humans. You can't just sort of upload the fix to all my doctors.
Yeah. I think the other access issue, and I don't know that it's unique to medicine. You guys may have other thoughts on this, but getting technology into the clinic is a challenge because there's reimbursement, there's liability. And so that's where I think the access could separate out. You know, at Penn, we might start using these all the time, but at smaller hospitals and community practices, they may have a harder time getting them into their systems, even though those are the populations who actually might benefit the most.
Although I'll give a counterexample. When I talk to people doing insurance claims, trying to fight to get insurance for their patients, it's a bigger benefit for the small hospitals because a place like Penn and Hupp has a whole team of people that do this, a big database of things for the past. At a small hospital, people tell me they have terrible time because they don't have the expertise in contesting where it's obvious to the doctor that this patient should be reimbursed for this procedure, but they don't know how to fight the insurance companies. So in this case, it's helping the underdog more than the people with more resources.
Yep. And I could see that. I think it's just a matter of whether they're going to make that investment or they have the room within their budget to make that investment because they're trading it off for something else.
Money helps.
So one keyword that I wanted to bring into the conversation is the Turing test. Does anyone want to explain that and kind of explain how it's pertinent to AI and generative AI?
Sure. Yeah. So the Turing test is named after Alan Turing, one of the founders of the field of computer science.
And AI.
And when the very first digital computers were coming online, a lot of people were interested and excited about the idea of whether computers were intelligent or not. And so Alan Turing said, well, the question of intelligence is actually maybe too hard to define or too hard to operationalize. So let's create this alternate test to say, could we imagine some future digital computer that was intelligent, and what aspects of what things would be necessary in order to exhibit intelligence? And so the test that he formulated was actually perfect for chatbots. It's now called the Turing test, but at the time was called the imitation game after a parlor game at the time, where people would go off into different rooms in a party and you would ask them questions and they would type back answers and you would try to guess who was whom. And so the Turing test is the same sort of formulation where you have a text-based interaction with a chatbot, and you as the human judge is trying to pick out which of the people who you're typing to is the human versus the machine. And the idea was once a machine was able to reliably convince you that they're human based on a text conversation alone, then maybe that's a sign that they're beginning to have this emergent intelligence. And so this had been a test that had been in our field for a long time, kind of poo-pooed and sort of silly for a while. But now I feel like we've actually come to the stage where we're very reliably above the threshold that I would consider for having passed the Turing test. So,
So for short conversations, it's impossible to tell if someone's a person or a computer. For long ones, you mostly can. I think it's relevant in a bunch of ways. But one is if you don't know whether you're talking to a doctor or talking to a bot, Alan Turing would say, it doesn't really matter.
Interesting.
People keep telling me chatbots don't really understand medicine. And I'm going, yeah, but Turing said that's a meaningless statement. If it gives at least as good answers as the doctor I'm talking to, what do I care whether it understands medicine? It's giving the right answer. Now it's not just that bots are passing the Turing test in the sense you can't tell if they're human. They write more convincing messages than humans do. They're more accurate given the same information. Many doctors have access to information the bots don't have, so the doctors are still better. But given the same information, they certainly write more empathetic statements than the average doctor, which is arguably a low bar. But doctors don't have that much time. The bots are very fast. There was a great, Jeff Hancock at Stanford did a great example. He had GPT even 3.5, an old crappy one, generate 50 public health messages of why you should get vaccinated. Pick the top 10. A bunch of them were pretty crappy back then. Compared them against the 10 the CDC used, which is arguably also a low bar. And the ones that he had picked were more convincing than the actual get vaccinated messages being used by our Centers for Disease Control. So these bots are not just passing for humans. You can generate images of faces that are more trustworthy than real photographs of people. They're rapidly becoming just slightly superhuman at almost everything, as long as it's a small piece. You get a big complicated case, I'm going to go to my doctor still.
Right.
When I always laugh because I say in clinic, humans can fatigue, right? The bot keeps on going with those empathetic statements. And when you're in clinic and you're 8 patients in and you're exhausted and you haven't had your coffee, like humans don't always perform the best either. So I think there are some merits there as well.
But I think it's important to realize this distinction between you can make awesome 1-minute videos that feel almost perfect even though they're not, and you can just with a 1-sentence request, you can have these bots that will fool you for 5 minutes holding a conversation. You can't tell whether it's a cranky teenager or a cranky teenager bot. But as you get to longer, more stories, they're not writing that great American novel, and they're not really putting together, I do a lot of work on therapy. They're great for a CBT kind of behavioral therapy session. They're really good at just reframing how to do this. They're not doing the full diagnosis, the full follow through. And there's a really super interesting question. People often, even though the bots give more empathetic statements than the doctors, people would rather have a slightly less nicely written thing from a real person than from a better written piece from a bot. And people get really pissed if you deceive them, if you pretend. Even things where we had a bot that was teaching recitation sections for class, and we initially framed it, I am Angela Duckworth, the bot. And it was clear it was a bot, it was not an exception.
Yeah.
And the student said, no, you're a bot. Don't say you're Angela Duckworth. Say you're the bot representing her or whatever. But people did not like being told this bot's a human when it's not. So I think there's a still open question of where the human touch comes in.
Yeah. Well, what's your opinion? Do you think it's just like something that's hardwired into us as humans, is that we prefer real live people, or do we think it's like a cultural attitude that has yet to shift?
Both. So I think it is the case that if you write the letter by hand rather than texting it, it's more real work you did. It's more there. It's you. If the bot generates that wonderful 3-page love note declaring my true love for Chris, he's going to go, yeah, Lyle was great. It's like, but how long do you spend, Lyle, crafting the prompt to get that 3-level love note to Chris? So I think there is something where real investment matters. I also think that particularly when you get the audio and video, it's so convincing that I think you'll see people being much more willing to suspend disbelief. There's already the case when you ask, would you rather talk to a real human being after 10 minutes wait on the helpline, or would you like to talk with a bot right now? Guess what? A majority of people would rather talk to the bot now. This is maybe not rocket science. You don't have to go to Wharton to figure this out. But there's a lot of cases where, sure, I would love to have an hour talking to my doctor, who's a wonderful guy, and we have great discussions. Unfortunately, he's got a fairly tight schedule. He makes lots of time for as much as he can. But when I don't have the time for him, I'll talk to the bot.
I think that another aspect of this is disclosure. So it's really important to disclose when people are talking to a bot. And
Totally.
I think trying to communicate appropriately that that's happening so that they can calibrate their own expectations, and hopefully we can communicate to them like what to expect and what not to expect from chatbots. Relating to this notion that they behave almost perfectly for very short conversations, but not as well for long form things. Another useful thing to, as we're building our own mental models of how this technology works at the moment, is to think of how much it knows about you is really limited to the single conversation that you're having right now. So if you're talking to ChatGPT, anything that you say to it during this conversation is independent and forgotten in the next conversation.
Well,
So
that's true of
currently.
the older version. The version I'm using actually of GPT even has memory. And when I build things for my students or my patients, they read in the medical record of the patient. They read in the background on the student. So that piece is
changing, but
really rapidly.
yeah.
Right? GPT-4 now has memory in it.
Yeah, but so just to be
Not
clear,
great.
Yeah, so when the chat bot is creating its conversation, it's based on some conversational history. Most of the time, that's just what you've discussed with it in the current window. Sometimes it retrieves additional information. So you could imagine a system that pulls up your patient health record and is able to consult with it as it's continuing the conversation. But that's something that has to be explicitly designed into the system so that it has access to that information. And then similarly for personal uses with GPT, Lyle's right that GPT has started adding in something called a memory, where if you say a statement about yourself, like I'm a professor, then sometimes you'll see a little signal that it says remembering a fact, and then it'll add that to a repository of
Interesting.
things that it knows about you. But I think, if you were trying to replace your doctor as a, patient trying to diagnose yourself, going down a hypochondriac line or whatever, then having repeated conversations with it might not yield the same result that you would mentally expect if you're assuming it to have a persistent memory and building if you're expecting it to have the kind of intelligence that would allow it to construct a representation of who you are and all those things that you've told it in the past.
Yeah. So you guys are applying, AI to so many different fields. Like Lyle, you're working with psychology and you're working in classrooms and you're using it, Angela, in a clinical setting. And I want to talk about those applications, but also trying to recognize that people still find the idea very hard to grapple with, especially when you're saying AI can imitate things very accurately and increasingly well. Why do we all sit around here with smiles on our faces? Why can we be optimistic and not fearful of this technology?
Well, if you're doing something that's high skill, like a doctor, it's not going to replace the high end. There's a lot of stuff you don't want to do, which are taking detailed notes. My wife's a therapist. She has to do detailed notes for the insurance company after every client she talks to. She doesn't yet have, but will soon have something that records, because these are all done online, right? This is video recordings, automatic summarization. Here's the key points, store that down. It's not replacing the human connection. It's not replacing the big insights, but all of that documentation for the insurance companies, which people mostly don't enjoy doing and which the patients never even see if they're lucky. So there's a lot of pieces that are low end. There are plenty of jobs that are being replaced. If you're writing copy editing, I recently took an example of a description of a piece of furniture by the manufacturer, 2 pages of PDF of crap. I said, give me a 2-sentence marketing summary. Beautiful, this vintage mahogany piece here. I can't do the wonderful BS it generated. Those jobs are going away because if it's something that simple as taking a 2-page PDF describing a piece of furniture and making it sound like this is God's gift to furnituredom, and it fits beautifully in your pre-Victorian, post-Victorian, postmodern house. I don't even know, right? So I think there's a lot of there will be people losing jobs. There is lots of reason for concern. This is something that's likely to make the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And I think for many people in medicine, this is only going to make your life better, both for the patients and for the doctors. So I can be both optimistic in the sense that it's mostly replacing relatively less skilled work. I'm perfectly happy people I know who work with non-disclosure agreements or legal agreements, even 20-page legal contracts. GPT is reading the contracts and making suggestions. Fine. Some lawyers are going to get way more efficient because they'll use AI to help do the first pass on it. Other ones who are doing low-end contract will lose their jobs. That's crappy for them. Why am I happy? Because I think I've seen many jobs come and go. I don't feel that bad that I don't have a typist anymore to type my handwritten notes I gave my first secretary. I don't use a travel agent anymore. I use Expedia or Kayak. A bunch of jobs were lost for travel agents. Life is not that bad not having a secretary or a travel agent anymore. Those people are mostly doing better things with their lives now, even though individual people suffered along the way, right? I don't want to minimize the disruption.
Yeah, I think the point that Lyle's touching on about potential for job displacement, that's my biggest worry. I have no sci-fi fears about Terminator robots things like that, but it's really just, I think the speed at which jobs would get displaced is the significant thing. I agree that we're able to retrain people to do things that AI won't be able to easily fill in. But I think there's also great reason for hope that it will make us more productive and more allow us to focus on the more interesting parts of our work. So I participated in a workshop on AI and gerontology that Penn School of Nursing organized. And one of the things that I learned from some of the physicians participating is they have a smartphone app that's based on a language model that with patient consent, they can record the conversation that they're having with the patient in the room, and it'll do the kind of summarization and pre-population of the notes that they must submit at the end. And they said that it's changed the way that they're interacting with their patient. So instead of having an experience where they're typing at their computer and looking over their shoulder, talking to the patient, it gives them much more time to actually be there physically present with the patient and much more engaged than they were compared to recent ways of that patient-doctor interaction. And so, that takes one element of the job of a physician, which is really just a data entry style element of the job, and removes that, or at least reduces it substantially, and allows them to focus on the more important aspects of their job. So I think that that's the reason for hope.
But the other piece is people always think about this as a substitution. How will I replace this job? And that's the first thing. But there's always 3 stages of new technology. First is substitution. You replace your horse-driven carriage with a horseless carriage and a car. But once you have it, there's more usage. Once you can have a voice-activated device that elderly people can use, they can talk more, they can get more questions, they can get more help. If they fall, they can call and actually have something screened to check who should be referred to. And then eventually you get whole new structures where people have suburbs growing because you have cars that drive further, or you have a whole new way of connecting where you're lonely and isolated at home, and the bot can help you find other people to talk to. And I think people way underestimate, and I think this is bad because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. People way underestimate the ability of these bots, these LLMs, these generative AIs, to change the way that we do things, to have much richer interactions. It's sort of crappy that I talk to my doctor once a year, and that's probably good because he's busy and I don't really love going to see him. I actually do. He's fun to talk to. But wouldn't it be great if I had someone with his expertise that was around every time I had a medical question, that I could chat with them and find some answers? And if I'm unsure, then I check with a real person. But there's so much more usage we could have. And certainly in mental health, we're massively underserved. Am I worried about my wife losing her job as a therapist? No, I'm worried about the 100 people that can't see her, the 1,000, the 10,000 people that would love to see her.
Right.
Because they can't afford it and because they don't have access. And this is going to be not as good as her for a long time, but so much better to have something that's at least somewhat helpful.
I agree. I think as an assistant, there's a lot of benefit there. Our counselors, where we're using it, and one of our counselors described this at a meeting last week when she was presenting the data, that really what it's replacing is the piece that they repeat over and over and over to every patient, right? And so if that piece can be done in advance, then they can have a more tailored, very specific conversation with the patient that's really individualized to the person. I'm curious for the one that they were using in clinic. Is that something that they've already embedded in clinic, or is it research? Because I have another concern about, it's not a concern, it's just, I think, a hurdle in medicine. But are they using it clinically? Because I'd like to use that in my clinic, but I couldn't even get a scribe in my clinic because, again, someone has to pay for it.
Right.
And we already knew that scribes had higher Press Ganey scores with your patients, but they cost money. And to be able to move them into the clinical structure, even when some of us were clamoring for it, there's just so many different things that a health system has to cover that it didn't rise to the top.
Yeah, they are using it. So I think there's actually several commercial applications now, and it may be that the advances in the language modeling technology have gotten to the point where, it's driven down that cost that would have been with a human in the loop scribe.
Nice.
So that it's cost effective. And yeah, it seemed like within this physician's practice, it was becoming like a very clearly popular thing that they were adopting it more widely.
AI scribes are really cheap, and they're increasingly built into every Microsoft product. You use Microsoft Teams or even Zoom, although Penn has turned it off for some reason. So scribes are going to come installed at no extra cost if you're using any sort of standard software. So I think the cost is getting low rapidly enough that you're going to have to turn off the scribe for a lot of things.
I guess so. Having someone, sitting in clinic and seeing all kinds of things that could come through, there's still, I hope so. Because I think it would be great.
To be clear, the time for change in fields like medicine or education is on the order of decades.
Yeah.
The technology is going to be here on the order of minutes to days. But that's still the time for adoption is insanely slow. So I don't want to confuse the technology side with, if I put my Wharton hat on, the business side. Yeah, you're not going to see that very quickly. And even though there are HIPAA compliant GPT versions at Microsoft, it's also easy, if you're not careful, to use OpenAI and give away all your data and violate privacy in many ways.
Right.
And the companies and the hospitals are terrified because some doctor somewhere today is uploading patient records asking questions, and she has no idea whether she's violating HIPAA or not.
Yeah.
So it's not that the paranoia is not entirely ill-founded.
Yeah.
And OpenAI and Microsoft are mostly going to be pretty careful, but it'd be better if it were something that was signed off by the hospital system that we guarantee and promise it's safe. I trust Microsoft if they promise to keep stuff private, to keep it private. I have a lot of HIPAA data sitting at Microsoft, but because there's so many dangers here and because the risks are so high, super slow before these things come in.
I hear you.
Yeah, I am curious. We talked a little bit about cost. We talked a bit about privacy concerns. But Angela, do you know what other things are kind of standing in the way of incorporating AI more into the clinical setting?
I mean, when we first were bringing it up, I remember we were doing focus groups with providers and patients, and there were providers who said the robots are taking over. And it was this sense of, not many, but they had some who really have this ick factor of like losing their job. And again, I think as we in genetics and telegenetics keep wanting to use technology to increase access, allow more people to be seen, thinking of it as an assistant or as a way to triage, I think trying to help providers understand that it's not a replacement of you. It's helping you, as you said, do your job better. And I think that culture shift will continue to move. And the comment that we got was several years ago. And now when we talk about it, we don't get as much of that. I think there's also getting into healthcare systems, privacy, large infrastructures is really hard. But I do think if they can get their heads around it, as I think about it and hear you guys talk about it, I think there are cost savings.
Yeah.
Someone has to make that really good argument that there's a cost savings here.
Don't worry, there are plenty of companies making that pitch right
Yeah.
now.
Well, and then there's that trust issue when it's external. But yeah, I mean, I think that they're going to have to keep moving that argument.
Yeah.
So that, I think there's just a lot of pieces to get past. I have to say, patients seem very open to it. I think the transparency piece is important. Although I guess, the more we do the work, we tend to find that people are interested in things, but then we always have to just take a deeper dive into the data to see who it's not serving. So we're not losing those people, or we're adjusting it for everybody.
And I'm going to put on the positive side. What I found is a lot of hospital systems only speak English.
Yeah.
And lots of people, I'm from California originally.
Right.
Guess what? Lots of people speak Spanish. Their English is really bad. The hospitals like UCLA try and provide Spanish-speaking doctors and translators. But it's so much nicer if people can ask questions in their native language. And if there's 50 languages, AI does a really good job. It's really hard to find a hospital that's got 50 people on staff that if you want to speak Thai or plenty of things that are not super obscure. So I think there's a bunch of other access issues.
Yeah.
All right, so I agree in the worry, but I want to put the positive side too, because I'm an optimist.
And then one other aspects of the aspects that you mentioned as an interesting impediment is like, how do you get medical providers to adopt it? And you used a term earlier that I was hoping you could expand on, where you were talking about co-designing chatbots, or can you elaborate on that and for the listeners say what co-design is?
So in our research, when we're creating digital tools, we've used, we used to use a term of like doing stakeholder interviews in advance to say, like, how do you expect this technology to work, or how would this technology work well for you? And now the field has kind of shifted to co-design. So as we have our ideas, we want to put it in front of people who will be users. That could be providers as well, and say, like, how could we design this to work for you? And doing that work up front, I think, is going to lead to a much better product that's going to be more likely to be adopted on the back end, is the argument.
And the same thing, if you look at many of the great failures, IBM Watson would be the textbook version, where IBM spent an insane amount of money building something that was supposed to help do diagnoses and make doctors' lives. And they didn't work with doctors at all. They didn't think about how it fit in the workflow. It's great. Someone looks over your shoulder and just annoys you occasionally, but doesn't make you more accurate or save you time. So even there, to co-design with physicians,
that could
even
go a
before you
long
get to the
way.
community, unless it's part of the workflow. So where do I think the biggest impediment? If you give tools that are designed by people that don't understand the people using the tools, whether those are patients or physicians, the tools are often really hard to design if you don't actually know what the work is like and you haven't been there and done it. And again, I think both on the provider side and the recipient side, way more co-design to do things. And that's not fast. It's not something you do at my startup with my Y Combinator and like in 3 months, I've got my co-design process there. It requires actually talking to people, which some of us computer scientists are not quite as good at as we might be if we were, say, psychologists or someone else. Not to insult my own.
Oh, no, you span both fields. You got the best of both worlds. I would love to hear more about the applications that the two of you are developing.
Stole my question. Goodness. But yes, I'm also curious.
So I think the one movement, and this would be more in your area, we want to move more towards the generative side. So we have our chatbots, which take people through that redundant conversation that a counselor has. So it's very easy for a counselor to say, like, these are all the things, and we create the algorithms.
And that's like an intake conversation where you're sort of doing triage, or what's...
It's actually a pre-test counseling session. So what is genetic testing? Why would you want to consider genetic testing? What are the benefits, risks, et cetera? And we have ongoing studies using digital like web-based interventions. But now we're also comparing those to chats. And the nice thing about the chats is that they're conversational. And even before we started this work, we asked patients up front, like, would you ever want to replace the visit you just had with a counselor, with sitting in front of the computer and getting the same information? And we thought they would all say, like, no, that's a bad idea. I want the person. And we asked them the advantages and disadvantages. You can reflect on what they think the disadvantages are. You don't know what you don't know. What if I don't understand? I can't ask my question. But they pointed out some advantages that were really fascinating. And one of them was, I can go at my own pace. I was like, oh my God, if you're in clinic with us, you're coming along at our pace, right? Like, we are not slowing down. Like, we like to. And they said, I can go back and revisit information, right? So like, and I don't have to be embarrassed by saying I don't understand. And so when we heard all this, we were like, oh, wow, we had designed our trial as the digital will be no worse than the human. And I was like, their responses suggested actually might be better by being able to tailor to them. So the question was, like, what are we covering? So it is a clinical encounter, and we're taking that piece that the counselor shares with every single patient, just that basic information. And then we always make counselors available if there are additional questions they have after using the digital tool. These studies are ongoing. They're randomized studies of 2 provider visits versus one with a computer and one with a provider. This is not generative AI. Again, this is just like the basic algorithm stuff. And we don't have the data yet, but we have really robust patient-reported outcomes and huge studies that are recruiting across the U.S. So it'll be really interesting. But what we're wanting to move into is more of the generative AI. So even if a patient asks a specific question, could we use our bank of counseling sessions to pull and say, the counselor's already answered this question several times. Can we also spare them that additional time? Because the number of patients who need genetic testing and to see a genetic counselor far exceeds the number of genetic counselors that we have. And it gets even worse when you get outside of big meccas, and academic institutions and cities, and you get out into more, community-based and rural areas. So that's some of the work we're doing. We haven't done that generative part yet. That's something that we're working with Kevin Johnson on, and we have some grants in queue for that. So we're very excited about moving in that way with some guardrails.
Yeah, no, it seems very clear. And I think the idea of being able to make something available to a much broader population than it's currently available to, like, that feels like the kind of enabling technology, the thing that technology ought to be enabling. So yeah, that's really great.
Can I ask a sidebar question? Okay, so this is me. I'm not technically minded kind of at all. But when you said at the very start of our conversation, like, this is just an algorithm versus something that's generative. We kind of know what that looks like a little bit in practice, but kind of on the coding side of things, what does that actually mean? Because the generative thing sounds more intelligent to someone non-specialized like me.
So I took it to mean that you could have a deterministic set of questions and answers. So you have pre-programmed the exact conversation flow, and you allow a limited number of responses from the patient. So much more
scripted. Here's the question, here's the answer. And the amazing thing about generative AI is you can have an ask me anything.
Right.
So we have an entire course worth of material. Ask the chatbot any question about it, and it will talk. We take training soft skills, how to make a plan for high school students, how to do informational interview, watch the video. We feed the whole video in. Now the bot will ask the student questions about the video. The student can ask the bot questions about the video. The bot will ask the student, tell me how this would apply in your life.
Right.
What sort of plans are you trying to make? That's nice. You want to make more friends. Could we make that more specific? That's a wish. What would that actually look like? An objective. What's stopping you? Not outside. No, what's inside you stopping you from doing that one? So rather than having a super scripted, do this, do this, do this, if you do this, do that, really quite open-ended. Give the chat bot, here's the background, here's the framework, the 4 steps in our planning process, and have the bot read this 5-page or whole book on how to do this sort of planning, and then interact with the student. What is she concerned about now? And it's a level of flexibility that has a totally different feel.
And
it's like talking to a real person.
It comes at a trade-off. So I think the previous way of doing it, where it is very scripted, you can imagine that as like the telephone tree that you navigate when you're interacting with your bank via telephone banking. So it's very structured, and it's not flexible. So it's not like a natural conversation, but you'll also never go outside the path of what it's capable of doing, right? So it'll only guide you to things that it could possibly do, like a balance transfer or something like that. And for like the customer support side of things, that's the trade-off. Like you can either have a very natural conversation with the customers, and it's probably going to be a more interesting and engaging and hopefully satisfying experience. But if you allow the bot to do anything, then sometimes it can go off the rails. So there's an example of like a Canadian airline where a customer was chatting with their generative AI customer bot, and the person asked if they have a bereavement fare, and the bot said, yes, it's a 10% discount and you can apply once you've taken your flight. And it confidently stated something that was not true.
Oh.
So, a telephone tree would have never given you that end point. So there's trade-offs.
There are, and I think most companies and certainly our educational bots are in the middle, where we tend to script. After you've had this hour-long video thing, we'll have segments of 5 minutes each where we're going to talk about these pieces. We have all sorts of checks to make sure people aren't using the bot. As there was a famous example of a Chevrolet site, which was super helpful, and people were using it to do their physics homework and their writing their English essays, because they would ask anything.
It was just like access to GPT for free.
And, and someone said, hey, no takesy backsies, can I buy a Jeep for $1? And it sold them a Jeep for $1. They never got it. But so you got to build a bunch of guardrails. We build in very different ones. What happens is, true in medicine, suicidal ideation. Someone says, I'm thinking about killing myself. We put a lot of guardrails in. What happens if someone says, hey, I want to answer on my physics homework? We have guardrails. So there's a whole bunch of guardrails. So I think the Wild West of Air Canada and the Chevrolet sites are
coming to a conclusion,
rapidly ending. And I think there's always some hallucination and always some danger. So you build reasonable expectations about these pieces and real humans on them.
Well, maybe you could describe to us what applications you're building with the technology, and then if you've got guardrails already in place, how you went about implementing them.
Yeah, so so I mentioned a bit about this one for high school students who want to learn soft skills, how to make plans, how to do informational interviews, watch a video. We'll then walk you through talking about it and how it applies to your life. Lots of guardrails to make sure you stay on subject. If you digress too far, it'll gradually pull you back in. Yes, Angela, we're glad you're excited about the Olympics, but now can we talk a little bit more about today's issues? We're building a bot to teach spoken conversational English to Indians in India. In Hindi is the first language. These bots can speak English, like speak it. There's a bunch of customization questions. It's annoying if the bots speak with an American accent. It's annoying if they use miles and other stupid things that are not the way that real people in India talk about the world, even in English. So trying to customize it to the local culture. We're building bots for people in high school who are trying to decide, should I self-refer for mental health help? Where it's really hard to know who you can talk to, particularly in a culture, we're talking about India here, where it's maybe not so comfortable to talk to your parents as some Americans, but not all Americans feel about talking to their parents, where people are not aware of what resources, they're not aware of even what questions to ask. So I think trying to figure out how to make these culturally sensitive to help people and to make it in a way that helps figure out for the bot and the person how much guardrail and structure, how much not. What questions should we engage in? Let's talk about the side effects of different SSRIs. What's an SSRI? Fine. That's a good question. Glad you asked that. Sorry, I didn't define it when I used it. Let me start there and not talk about certain things. I'm considering killing myself. I'm sorry. You need to go talk to someone. Here's the appropriate person with the number for you to talk to. I'm sorry, I'm a bot. I can't engage with that. So lots of guardrails and lots of flexibility, but not too much flexibility.
And then, Chris, you're the only one that hasn't answered. What are you doing right now?
So I'm in my lab, we've been building a bunch of tools to try to make it easier for other people to develop systems. So we have several open source software packages that are meant to help people build their own systems. So one of the interesting things in my mind about recent developments in chatbots is that they don't only have to rely on this kind of next token prediction in order to generate text. So early versions of GPT were terrible at math, right? And you know that if they're just trying to predict the next word probabilistically, then they probably will have seen 2 + 2 = 4, and so therefore can output 4. But if you give it 2 random numbers, it's just going to try to predict some other random number, which is not the right way to do mathematical
To the point
reasoning.
they were useless as high school, even elementary school. 13 + 2, quantity divided by 2, they would get that wrong enough that it was not useful for a tutor.
Wow.
Right.
I mean, stunningly stupid. These things are so smart and so stupid,
Yeah.
and it's really hard to predict when they're going to be smart and when they're going to be stupid.
So one of the exciting new developments is allowing them to know when they should call out to an external tool. So for the math, when they should be able to access a calculator rather than trying to generate themselves. And you can extend that to all sorts of different software tools. So if you want to have a bot that is able to access the weather in your current location, then you can give it access to a weather app and it can retrieve the weather for your location. So we have a system called Connie, which is makes it easier for people to develop chatbots that use function calling like that. And then we have another system called Data Dreamer that helps create synthetic data. So one example that might be relevant for medicine is you've got sensitive data that you don't want to distribute beyond your own hospital system, but you could create data that looks like your data and then distribute that to researchers. And so I've become very enamored with the idea that synthetic data is a way of A, improving large language models for a variety of tasks, and B, making it easier to distribute data that doesn't have privacy concerns so that other researchers can engage with it.
Nice.
But Chris is saying it's very relevant in medicine because these bots don't work unless they can actually read the patient records, look at what were similar patients, grab the chest x-rays from the other similar patients, pull them out, show them to the physician. So
yeah, I should have mentioned that one of the most key parts of this ability to function call is also called retrieval augmented generation. So that's been a major advancement in the past year for large language models where the propensity to hallucinate can be substantially reduced but not eliminated by adding into the context a bunch of relevant information and then essentially having the LLM summarize it. So
read this textbook, read the standard instructions, read the script of the patient, find the 10 patients that were most similar. What did we do in each of those cases? Summarize this for us. So don't think of these things just as standalone, right? Chris is part of this movement that says these are not just little bots that think in their head. They can actually go out and query the web. They can read manuals. They can look at patient records. It's much more an integrate information together. And so if you want to give something that's giving genetic counseling, here's the manual. Give it. Have retrieval augmented generation. We love RAG, big fancy name, but it works really well. Read the manual and check through it. Find the right thing to do. What would you recommend? Look at these case studies. Here's the recommendations that our counselors gave before. Find all of them. Is there a consensus with them? Is there not? So it's much more become a much more flexible system. It's not just a little one AI system that answers things. It's something that reads and thinks about the world.
yeah,
Not very good at the thinking, but very good at the reading.
yeah, and I think that's a place where all of us can bring in our own information, right? So each person can has a set of access to documents, like the HUP has its own document collections. You can customize your answers by giving the physician guides for different diagnoses or different things like that. That'll cause a much more appropriate and customized response from a system.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding correctly, it's almost like giving AI a longer leash while still keeping those barriers kind of in the...
Yeah, I think my analogy for it is I sort of think of the retrieval augmented generation as an open book exam rather than a closed book exam. So in a closed book exam, the students do have to use whatever has been stored in their brain and however accurately they can remember something to write a response. Sometimes there'll be errors. And I think on average, the quality is going to be much lower if I have my students take a closed book exam. But if I let them consult the textbook or read the internet and then produce a response, that's going to increase the factuality and the quality.
Much better. And it's open calculator and it's open everything.
Yeah.
So these new AI agents are much better. I love your open exam. That really is the right metaphor.
The other thing that I saw that I thought was really interesting in applying it to medical records and to help with medical pieces, it was a computer science faculty member at Northeastern, and they were describing how like a radiologist has to read an x-ray and then they need to go to the medical record to get context. And what they were training their model to do was not just to give the background, but why, so that the doc could check it and say, okay, that makes sense. So this, in my mind, is another way of auditing. So it's an assistant, because originally when they did it, it didn't describe the why. So they had one where it had totally hallucinated and miscalled something. And they went back to the medical record and they couldn't find where or why it had come up with the fact that this patient had a brain tumor, where there was nothing in the medical record. And it was probably, they said, just like the predicting the next word. And so if it says like patient has a brain tumor and it's from this particular note, if it doesn't resonate with the physician and they have a way to fact check it, they can discount it, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah,
It's a
absolutely.
lot of work. We've been building models to predict pediatric sepsis. And the question is not just to predict who's at risk of getting sepsis within 48 hours of admission, but tell the clinicians these are the relevant predictors.
Yeah.
And then it turns out mostly those are not what you want to know, because younger babies are at higher risk than older kids. But every clinician knows that. People who had a high risk score on admission are at higher risk. So it's not just telling you why you made the prediction, but tell me which facts I should have looked at that I might have overlooked.
And then it generates trust, right?
And
Because then it feels like your assistant and not someone
and
going
it should
rogue on
generate
you.
trust, because sometimes it gives an answer. You go, oh, if that's the reason,
I need
I'm going to trust
step
my
in.
clinical expertise here. So part of being trust is knowing when to trust and when not to.
Exactly.
One of the weird things about AIs is they're alien intelligences, and they're on average often better than humans, but they make mistakes humans would never make. So if you think of a self-driving car, I'm told by people I talk to who are senior people at Cruise, they have cars that are safer than the average alert American driver, sober driver, but it's still a case that occasionally they'll drag some corpse 12 feet across the streets of San Francisco in a way that a human never would
do.
horrifically. And if you want trust, people think about the worst case and think of this as a clinician.
Yeah.
What are people going to notice? Not your average performance. No one understands averages.
The worst case.
What's the worst case, and what's the most unexplicable, ununderstandable thing you'll do? And now AI's generators is terrible, because an alien intelligence, they're super smart, but they don't think like people. They're going to make really different mistakes from us.
Yeah.
And occasionally those mistakes are horrible. Self-driving car just plows into somebody. Science person at Cruise, and he said, Kearney's trying to train them to recognize stray dogs. How hard is this? You've got an AI. He says, well, in our training set, all the dogs are attached by leashes to people. So statistically,
The dog without the leash.
a dog without a
no.
leash is extremely unusual, and he'll fix it. But it's taking him a week to worry about this fact that statistically dogs are always attached to leashes, and so a dog without a leash is probably an error of processing. Oh, but no, if their self-driving car hits your dog, you're going to be pissed. Rightly so, right? And it's hard to find all the edge cases, and medicine is every bit as bad as driving cars. I don't have to tell you this. It's got a lot of weird edge cases, and the AIs can be superhuman and still unacceptable, because if you're killing my mother because of the obvious thing any good doctor would have caught, I'm going to be justifiably unhappy. So I think we're going to have to build systems that have trust, but trust is engineering the whole process.
Yeah, and
So that they're humans overviewing the decisions, so that you know when you should be believing it or not. It's not just about making a 100% reliable AI, because not going to happen.
it's not going to happen. Yeah, and I think that lack of the 100% reliable AI and its relation to trust is also problematic because you have situations where you overtrust the AI. So I think, with Lyle's analogy of the alien intelligence, I think that's great. And, I think there's some risk that comes in as the systems get better and better. And as they approach 100%, you have a tendency to think, oh, they're always going to do the right thing. And I think this is a problem with self-driving cars where 99.999% of the time they're trustworthy and they drive you perfectly, and it's that
Well, it's the same thing
small.
with the autopilots on airplanes where they had to change the training procedure for pilots because they were exposed too little. So it wasn't too much trust, too little exposure to cases.
Yeah. It's funny when we were using the family history algorithm, again, not generative AI, but just using this algorithm. And when it said someone met criteria, it was almost always right. But when it said they were not a candidate for genetic testing, it was wrong about a quarter of the time. And that felt really uncomfortable to us because we were giving people the wrong information.
Yeah.
We could go and correct it because we've discovered it. But then when my staff who were using it, they were just like, nope. And so then they wanted to go back to, just using it to collect the information, but then to have a human look over every case. And so when you lose that trust, it can be really hard to regain it. So now I've said, well, okay, let's say that it can solve the easy cases and we're going to do human review on the hard cases. Can we test that out? And that's in a very low risk scenario, not like cars or airplanes or chemotherapy for your loved one.
Right. I say the sepsis.
Sepsis.
You worry if you miss it.
Yeah.
You've killed a kid.
Yeah. So in those high stakes areas, we'll have to think about it differently, perhaps.
Yeah.
And that trust will be really important.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, this has been such an engaging conversation. I've enjoyed every minute of it. I do want to, sent to me right from Dr. Johnson himself, he did want to ask you the question of, I'll preface by saying, as much as I've played around with ChatGPT and OpenAI, you might run into a roadblock of, I can't, as you were talking about earlier, but when maybe a little tongue-in-cheek, but when will generative AI be able to say, I don't know?
It's rapidly being trained. So people are working really hard on upgrading it. I think there's two big questions that will be solved the next year that are now. It's very bad at saying it doesn't know. And it's very bad at asking clarification questions, the version of that, which is most people that I know use AI, they don't know enough of what information, a background. Write me a cover letter. You didn't tell me who it's for, why it's there, what they're looking for, right? Write me a promotion letter for someone who does a great job if you give me the resume and you give me the description of the piece. So rapidly, these systems are being retrained to come back to you and either say, I don't know, but also, here's the other information that I wish I had. If I had this, I could answer your question. So I think they pretend they're giving conversations right now, but they're not very conversational in the way that a real human is, where oh, right, this is what she's probably asking me, but I think she's got some false assumption about what's going on. You with me? There's a lot of theory of mind of what's going on. So I think I don't know is only the tip of the iceberg, but it's a very big iceberg of when you answer someone a question, you shouldn't be just answering the question, right? Will this drug have this interaction with that drug? That's a good question. But how about looking at what other drugs I'm taking that might have other side effects I hadn't thought about? Is it inappropriate? There's plenty of other pieces. So it's answering the questions that you didn't ask and getting the background information. Still pretty crappy at, but I'm super optimistic that that's going to get way better.
Yeah. Well, everyone, thank you so much for being here. We're so lucky to have you. And also thanks, Penn Engineering Online, for letting us use your beautiful studio. It was so much fun to, trade the Zoom background that we usually use for being in person. And I know Dr. Johnson is so sad he wasn't here today, but is going to love every second of this conversation. So thanks for joining us, y'all.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
So fun.
Well, today's episode didn't disappoint, did it? I learned a lot even listening to it again. And I think the thing that really rings true to me is how rapidly this area is moving, but how much it is likely that chatbots will be the first experience we have with AI in the newest forms, generative AI, large language models, at scale in healthcare. There's a tremendous number of people working on it. The studies are moving very, very quickly. And I think it's in some ways lower risk than some of the other areas because it may well turn out to be patient-facing and better than the alternative, which is poor access to care for so many, many people in this country. Anyway, thank you to all of our guests for coming here today and providing you guys with some really, I think, useful information in a slightly entertaining way. By the way, for our music this week, I wanted to share a song called Shadow Side by my friend Rhett McDaniel. You'll see more information about him in the notes for this podcast. I actually think this song is a good reminder of how we can learn to embrace an AI and its capabilities, even though there may be some concerns about its use early on, rather than leaving it completely undiscovered and in the dark. Anyway, thanks for listening to this episode. To hear about new releases and to find out more about what we might be up to in the future, find us on social media at Informatics in the Round, which is at Info in the RND on X, Instagram, Threads, and TikTok. And if you have any questions or ideas you want to hear for new episodes, please email us or use any of the socials and send us some information. We would absolutely love your feedback and your suggestions. Have a great rest of your day.
Sometimes I'm doom and gloom, blackout curtains at high noon, cartoons and a bottle of booze for a day or two. But when you see me get like this, you call me on my shit, tell me to snap out of it, you always know what to do, yeah, 'cause I don't have to hide my shadow side, 'cause you know that's not really me, no. When I start to lose sight of you and you bring me back to where I need to be, yeah. You shine that light on my shadow side. You're the yang to my yin, you're the tonic to my gin. Whatever sticky situation we're in, I know we can win. Sometimes I'm a trampoline, up and down with no in between. Day-to-day reality.